Do you enjoy outsider heroes fighting for personal glory and vengeance? Do you long to explore wild and deadly fictional places far from civilization? Then grab your blade and by crumb, let's conquer the savage worlds of sword and sorcery. So what is sword and sorcery? Sword and sorcery is a fantasy subgenre defined by its rugged heroes, mastery of the blade, and thrilling adventures in untamed lands. While romance, magic, and the supernatural often find their way into these tales, the heart of sword and sorcery lies in the personal struggles of its protagonists, rather than the looming threats faced by entire civilizations. Pulp writer Fritz Lieber coined the term sword and sorcery in 1961 as a play on existing genres of cloak and sword, a term used for historical adventure, and cloak and dagger for spy fiction. Lieber meant to evoke Robert E. Howard's fantasy stories like Conan the Barbarian, tales that would eventually become synonymous with the sword and sorcery genre. Lieber's own creations, especially Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, would further solidify the genre's identity. Sword and sorcery is an older niche within fantasy fiction. Its popularity has risen and fallen many times over the years, and been refreshed again and again in the process. Like epic fantasy, it unfolds within a magical secondary world, as opposed to our world. However, the emphasis on the personal conflicts and the intimate scale of the stakes sets it apart from epic fantasy. And speaking of sword and sorcery flavour, now you've got the taste for it, let's discuss the characteristics of a sword and sorcery world in more detail. Here are some of the most common characteristics and tropes of the genre. Now, whether you choose to follow them or subvert them is entirely up to you, but it's helpful to know what notes your audience will expect. Sword and sorcery has its origins in pulp stories, and it's almost always packed with swashbuckling action, adventure, and cliffhangers. Expect high-octane action as part of these stories. Also from pulp, a noir mood is very common in sword and sorcery. The bad guys are probably in charge, and that femme asking for help, well, she tends to be fatale. Worlds tend to be dark and dangerous, poisoned by corruption and the ambition of man. And speaking of ambition, it's often painted as a dangerous thing in sword and sorcery, and advancement happens at someone else's expense. Take the soul-sucking sword of Elric of Melniboné as an example. And since we are speaking of the folly of man, civilization is often painted as problematic, even a trap. And while the wilderness will also kill you, I don't call it sword and sorcery for nothing, at least you'll die free. Sword and sorcery heroes tend to be outsiders. Protagonists are often thieves or mercenaries, or occasionally both, on the fringes of society. Isolated lone wolf characters, often morally grey, begrudgingly join a partner with complementary skills to pull off a job. But mistrust and betrayal are also common tropes for those partnerships. And speaking of heroes, or lack thereof, the chances are your characters aren't in this for justice, truth, and apple pie. Most protagonists in sword and sorcery expect to be well paid or rewarded for their work, either in cold hard coin or sweet petty vengeance. As a fantasy genre, magic is usually present in sword and sorcery genres, but, as you'd expect, it's not rainbows and fairy dust. Magic tends to be rare, dark, dangerous, and most often wielded by a powerful enemy. It's often uncodified and misunderstood, and it's definitely not a practical substitute for technology. So how do your dark, selfish protagonists succeed in this dark, dangerous world? Often, at least partly, through brutal combat. Unlike the nearly invulnerable heroes of other fantasy subgenres, sword and sorcery heroes often take a nasty beating before emerging victorious. Endurance and persistence is often their most endearing and heroic quality. They are the Rocky Balboa of fantasy heroes. And speaking of brutal combat, please help me do battle with the gods of the algorithm, and like this video if it's helpful. So now we've gone through what sword and sorcery looks like, let's talk examples. After all, one of the best ways to learn to write and world build in a genre is to read it extensively. So here's a bunch of examples of sword and sorcery in literature. But first, a quick warning. As I mentioned before, sword and sorcery is a genre with its origins in pulp and noir fiction of the early 20th century. And the earliest works listed here are very much of their time. That is to say, they may include content that modern readers including me, find disturbing. The sword and sorcery fantasy subgenre retained some of those works' regressive attitudes even until the 1980s. That's when sword and sorcery had a resurgence in interest and a creative and social revival. Around that time, writers began imagining what the future of sword and sorcery could be. They often borrowed an elevated prose style from literary fiction, and sometimes included the bigger stakes typical of epic fantasy stories, whilst maintaining the mercenary or outsider protagonists and the gritty up-close combat of traditional sword and sorcery. This evolution has continued, allowing sword and sorcery to expand to include a more diverse range of voices, both in protagonists and authorship. So if you do want to put your own unique twist on the genre, there has never been a better time to get creative with it. And on that note, let's kick off with the old school Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard, one of the most iconic heroes associated with sword and sorcery. Robert E. Howard's iconic tales tell of Conan, a fierce Cimmerian warrior, as he battles through a world of sorcery, monsters, and treacherous enemies. If you do pick up the original, expect to read opinions and reflections of the 1930s, including the racism and sexism of the time. The Elric of Melniboné sequence by Michael Moorcock is another classic of the genre, dating from about 40 years after Conan in 1972. Elric, a brooding, sorceress, and rather toxic emperor, navigates a grim, decadent, and chaotic multiverse, wielding his cursed sword, Stormbringer. Elric loathes this sword, which, spoiler alert, is actually a soul-drinking demon, but he's almost helpless without it. This kind of dark personal conundrum is typical of sword and sorcery. Damned if you do, and damned if you don't. A much more recent example of sword and sorcery is the blade itself, from 2006 by Prince of Grimdark himself, Joe Abercrombie. In a world of political intrigue and impending war, a disgraced warrior and a cunning inquisitor find themselves entangled in a complex web of betrayal. Again, we see disgraced lone wolf heroes, betrayal, and intrigue, all common tropes of the sword and sorcery genre. Another great example of modern sword and sorcery is Throne of the Crescent Moon by Saladin Ahmed, described as sword and sorcery fantasy set against an Arabian Nights backdrop. Dr. Abdullah Makhloud, a ghoul hunter, battles dark forces threatening to engulf his beloved city. And speaking of monster hunters, The Witcher by Andrzej Sapkowski, most famous from either the video games or the Great Cavalization by Netflix, also follows a monster hunter, Geralt of Rivia, as he navigates a, you guessed it, morally ambiguous world full of mythical creatures, political intrigue, moral conundrums, and blurred lines between good and evil. Classic. For even more reading list recommendations, I've included a blog in the description of this video, so go check it out. Oh, and let me know your favourites that I missed. Sword and sorcery RPGs are very common. After all, the genre aligns very closely with the beginnings of the tabletop RPG hobby. Old school revival or OSR games are often a great fit for running sword and sorcery campaigns. Because difficult, dangerous combat is a main focus of the subgenre, these systems are often more mechanically dense or crunchy. That's also partly because, as we now know, our sword and sorcery player characters tend to be lone wolf warriors, or at least reluctant allies forming a party, operating on the edges of civilization, which means that resource management can be an important element of the mood, introducing a sense of survivalist desperation to the game. Some examples of crunchy RPG systems for sword and sorcery include dungeon crawl classics. Designed specifically to harken back to old-school feel dungeon crawls, it focuses on simplicity, randomness, and player-driven narratives. Or how about Zweihander, a grim and perilous, their words, role-playing system with a focus on gritty realism, complex character backgrounds, and a dark, atmospheric setting. RuneQuest, set in a grim world of squabbling gods, is where the mortals are but pawns. It emphasizes a skill-based system where characters grow organically by using their abilities, and features a deep connection between characters and divine runes. Very cool. There's also, of course, GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system, which is often used for sword and sorcery because it's a bit more realistic and less high fantasy heroic as an approach to role-playing. But if you're more into rules-light RPGs, there are systems that work for sword and sorcery in that category too, although it's a less common combination. Savage Worlds is a versatile and fast-paced role-playing system, using standard D6 dice to resolve actions, with a focus on cinematic action that really serves more modern sword and sorcery genres well. Or how about Barbarians of Lemuria, a narrative-focused, rules-light system that literally sounds like the definition of old-school sword and sorcery. Are you ready for this? The second age of man is a savage time of sorcery and bloodshed, where strong men and beautiful women battle with warlords, priests, magicians, and gladiators to carve a bloody path to the throne of Lemuria. If that doesn't give you sword and sorcery flavour, I don't know what does. I still don't know why we can't have beautiful men and bloodthirsty women, but maybe that's just me. For more sword and sorcery RPG suggestions, check out the blog in the description. But if you're here on the World Anvil channel, it's probably because you love world building as well as writing and RPGs. So let's discuss world building, sword and sorcery. As well as all the normal questions like technology level, themes and mood. For that, see our video on world building meta. Here are some advanced tips for world building and writing more modern sword and sorcery. Tip number 1, don't forget the corrupting magic. Remember that sword and sorcery tends to be a low magic genre, but magic is still present, and it's often critical for your stories. So how does magic manifest in your sword and sorcery world? Who has access to it? Does it corrupt? And if so, who and how does it corrupt? Are its origins natural and pure, or dangerous, such as demonic, chaotic, or eldritch magic origins? In general, magic is more likely to be in the hands of the villains than the heroes in sword and sorcery. And if a hero does have access to it, it commonly causes them both short and long-term problems. Magic is often feared rather than admired by the general populace. So how does magic work in your world? And how do people react to magic, if they even know it exists? Tip number 2, draw lines for your heroes. Isolated, outcast, and lone wolf heroes are a key trope of sword and sorcery, so consider what they are outside of. Is it civilization versus the wilderness? Are they outside of the law, of religion, or outside of accepted society? Whatever you choose, you'll need to world build these elements, so they feel nuanced and detailed. After all, they're critical to the core of your protagonist's struggles. These lines will also define how your protagonists can solve problems within your story. For example, a character outside the law can't go running to the police if something goes wrong. They'll have to solve their problems in a different way. And speaking of heroes, tip number 3 is personal stakes. They're a big deal in this genre, and personal cost is critical for making your world and stories feel gritty and dialing up the hurt of your moral quandaries. So what's at stake for your character? What problems do they experience day to day? Are those related to their outsider status? What rewards will they try to exact for a job? And of course, what would they give anything to protect? What would they never sacrifice? Defining these aspects will really help you keep the spirit of the genre. And tip number 4 is combat. After all, high-action combat is often an important part of sword and sorcery, so does it have a unique place in your world? Depending on your world building, combat could be made more evocative of the larger issues at play. For example, the dual swords and magic of The Witcher are evocative of the dual threats he faces, and also evocative of his dual nature as half mundane, half magic, a man on the outside of both spheres. And if you don't want to get fancy with special weapons or magical combat, remember at least to consider what kinds of combat your characters excel in. Are they sneaky roguelike characters, or bow-wielding sharpshooters, or bare-knuckle brawlers? How did they learn these skills, and how do they reflect their backgrounds and their larger position within, or more probably outside, society? And tip number 5 is mood. Instilling the atmosphere of a world is critical in Sword and Sorcery, and that atmosphere should generally be pretty grim. Of course, prime candidates are the kinds of things you'd use in TV, like lighting, dark, set dressings, generally grimy, tattered, or have seen better days, or even the weather. Anyone who's played The Witcher 3 knows how often it rains in that world. Beyond that, you can instill an appropriately grim mood with selfish side characters or NPCs, dire current affairs, two-edged successes, and elements like lies and betrayal to really establish the noir feeling in your worlds. And perhaps most importantly, you'll need to keep track of those selfish characters, corrupt magic systems, and twisty-turny plots. Whether you're crafting Sword and Sorcery as a novel, or plunging your players into a dungeon of despair, World Anvil will keep your world organized, help you figure out what to build next with tailored world-building templates, and keep your project on track to success. My husband and I built it for exactly that reason. I've also linked some amazing Sword and Sorcery worlds from our community, that's like over 2 million world builders, to give you some more inspiration for the Sword and Sorcery genre and the different ways you can go with it. You'll find all of those links in the description. Are you ready to conquer the savage worlds of Sword and Sorcery? Then grab your warhammer and go world build!